It's my pleasure to introduce my new friend, who I share a name with, Brenda Arthur, who's been working ever since she came to West Virginia to tell us all about the refugee problem that's been going on here, unbeknownst to us. And she's been digging and doing FOIAs and everything to get information and talking to the legislature. And we really appreciate all she's doing. And she's going to inform us now about what all she's found out. Brenda?
Thank you. Thank you. At the outset, I would just like to say that I appreciate the Constitution Party and what you're about, what you're doing, the stand you take, and the fact that you support the Constitution, which seems a strange thing in many cases today. Also that you know and believe and embrace the fact that our rights come from Almighty God and not from government.
Amen.
So I applaud you for that stand. Starting out, I passed out an information packet, and there'll be a lot of other materials that I'll pass out as we go along. But I want to start with this, but let me give you some background first. It was probably, I'd say on the order of about 3 years ago. This time 3 years ago, we were seeing in the news constantly, and every news report you read or saw was talking about the wars in the Middle East and all the upheaval, and the Middle East was on fire. And there were so many refugees that were being created by these wars, and ISIS was on the march, and the caliphate. With all of that, there was an interest on my part, and of course on the part of many others, to find out more about this and try to figure out, what was happening, what this was all about. That led to some research, and also at the time I was seeing reports that Charleston was among 47 cities across this country that had been targeted by the Obama administration in which to expand the refugee program. So I had no knowledge of that. The refugee program, what's that? Okay, they're going to bring in some of these refugees from the Middle East, I guess. So in order to try to get information, what I did is I contacted our elected officials, right? Isn't that the first thing you do? You think, well, shouldn't they know? I mean, they're in a position of authority and power, and they should know what's going on. So I called probably 3 or 4 delegates, House of Delegates members here in West Virginia at the time. And I called the mayor of South Charleston. I called the mayor of Charleston. And everybody told me, we know nothing about this. We've not heard any reports or anything that any refugees are coming to West Virginia. So for the time being, I accepted that because I thought, well, they should know. So a little time, that was probably spring of 2015, and then fast forward to November of that year. And on one afternoon, my sister calls me at 1 o'clock, and she says, do you know that they're having a rally in Charleston across from the courthouse at 5 o'clock, and it's a rally to bring refugees in here, Syrian Muslim refugees specifically. I said no. So now all this is starting to come together. Why would this group have a rally? And about 150 people or so attended that. And I thought, I have to get down there and protest this. So I did that, and one Vietnam vet joined me about 30 minutes later. And of course, some of the comments and, the famous hand sign and that people use a lot of time, all of that was exhibited. But from that rally that was held in November about mid-November of 2015, I thought, well, I'll call the governor's office. I haven't done that yet, and I'll find out. Now, the governor's got to know if there are going to be refugees coming in here. So early December, I waited a couple weeks, early December, I called the governor's office and got through various staffers. And I think it was about a week later that his chief of staff, a man by the name of Chris Stadelman, called me back. And I asked him the question. I said, has the governor been informed, or are we going to get refugees here in Charleston and throughout the state of West Virginia? And he told me no. He said, no, the governor has not been informed that any refugees are coming here. Well, as an aside, fast forward from that point of December 2015 to June the next year of 2016, and I did a FOIA request and got the state of West Virginia refugee plan that the governor had signed, Governor Tomlin had signed actually 3 or 4 months before his staffer told me that. So once I heard that, again, I thought, well, the governor's got to know, right? He's our highest elected official in the state. So by the spring, or around May of 2016, there was an article that came out through Refugee Resettlement Watch that some people had told me about. And Ann Corcoran, she runs that national blog, and she's been doing it for about 11 years, and she's considered one of the foremost experts in the country on refugee resettlement. And the article that comes out, and there was also an article in the Charleston Gazette-Mail, and that article said, group considers bringing hundreds of refugees to Charleston. And I thought, okay, now the pieces are really starting to come together, and obviously this has been, you know, under the table or very subtle, and it's been moving along without the public's knowledge. So that was really the event, that article, that spurred me into action. And I thought, I know nothing about this refugee program and how it works and how these refugees get here and the vetting and, you know, all the questions that we all have. So I thought, I need to affiliate myself with a national group that can have access or lead me to people who know about this. So I had donated to Act for America before, and I knew about them, and Brigitte Gabriel, the founder, many of you probably have seen her on TV, you know, when she's interviewed about terrorism and so forth. So I called their organization and said, you know, who can you refer me to, or what information do you have on this subject? And they were very helpful, and then they came back to me later and said, why don't you start a chapter in West Virginia? We don't have any. So I said, well, you know, I was hesitant at first, but I thought, okay. So from that, I started a chapter here, the Greater Charleston Area chapter of Act for America. And Act for America is the largest national grassroots organization, over 750,000 members, that fights terrorism and defends America's liberty and values. So this was right along the line of what I was trying to accomplish. So then around July, about a month or so after that, is when I made a FOIA request. I found out I'd heard of FOIA requests, but I found out you could make a FOIA request. But I didn't know what to ask for. So again, I was getting some help and training from people, you know, that were leading me along the way. So that's when I made a FOIA request to the Department of Health and Human Resources, and I asked them for the state of West Virginia refugee plan for fiscal year 2016, and we were just coming on to fiscal year 2017. And I said, I want both of those. And I also learned of another document that's critical, and I'll show you that document here as we go along. It's called the R&P Abstract. And the R&P Abstract stands for Reception and Placement. Now, this is a document that the contractor, the subcontractor, in our case in West Virginia, it's Catholic Charities of West Virginia. They file this report every year with the State Department, telling them how many refugees they want to accommodate or they want to bring into the state. Now, here in West Virginia, Catholic Charities has been operating as the only resettlement contractor for over 37 years. Some states like California, Florida, Texas, New York, I mean, they have numerous. I think California has 32 resettlement sites operating in that state to bring refugees in, and Florida 20 some, and so on. So you have at the top level, there are 9 contractors that contract with the federal government to bring in refugees, and underneath them are there used to be about 350, and now under the Trump administration, with the slowdown that's occurred, they're in the neighborhood of about 300, maybe a little more than that currently. So these subcontractors on the state level bring the refugees in. They get paid by the head to do this. So this is a money-making operation. These organizations that are doing this, they present themselves as humanitarian and aren't we wonderful and we're moral and almost a sense of we're better than you because, you know, you're opposed to this. But they're getting paid for this, and there's big bucks in this. Under the Obama administration, these 9 contractors were getting about $1.5 billion a year. Now under Trump, with the estimated numbers that he has proposed to Congress that he wants to bring in for the current fiscal year, it's about $1 billion. Every year, whoever is president files what's called a determination with Congress. This is the first one that President Trump filed for the fiscal year 2018. And what this report does, it breaks down the nationalities and parts of the world and everything, the numbers that the president wants to bring in to the United States. And then it gives a dollar cost estimate at the back. So President Trump, this is his first one that he did. He filed this with Congress. It's usually filed around mid-September. Now, Congress is supposed to hold hearings every year when they get this, or around the time they get this. They have failed their duty to the American people. I think only twice that we've been able to confirm since 9/11 has Congress held hearings on this. And it was Jeff Sessions, in fact, in the fiscal year before he became Attorney General, his last 2 years in the Senate, and he was the head of the, I believe it was the Intel Committee or the Judiciary Committee and the subcommittee on refugees, and he held a hearing and tried to nail down some of this information, because they're supposed to hold those hearings and then consult with the president about the dollars involved, the money that they're going to fund for this. And usually, I tell you what's happened. It's been a rubber stamp process all this time, which brings me to the point of, where did this refugee program, or this racket, as I call it, many other people call it, where did this come from? Where did it start? We've always brought refugees into our country, and that's what a lot of the proponents, in fact all the proponents, will tell you. Well, we have to bring refugees in. These people are in dire need and so forth. Well, yeah, we've always brought refugees in, but we used to do it under a sane method. And what would happen is a church group, maybe a city group, Kiwanis, Lions, Rotary, would sponsor a family. And that family would be brought in, and that group would take care of all their needs. They would get the kids enrolled in school, they would help the parents find a job, find them an apartment or a place to live, and so forth. Now, in 1980, there was in fact, when I tell you who sponsored it, it'll say a lot. Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden sponsored a bill called the Refugee Act of 1980. Jimmy Carter signed it into law. And it was probably about 8 to 10 months before Ronald Reagan took office in 1981. From that Refugee Act of 1980, it gave birth to an industry that the federal government, in essence, created. And with that industry came money, federal money, lots of money. I think initially, as I recall, the amount that Congress allocated for that refugee program was in the neighborhood of about $200 million. And as the years have gone on, that grew to where it was $1.5 billion under Obama. Now, having said that, that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of cost. That in no way includes the cost to the states, for what the states have to pay for the cost of educating the refugee children, for the cost of interpreters, for state employees who work on the refugee program, for the cost of Medicaid, and for the cost of cash welfare. Now, under this refugee law, the federal government was supposed to reimburse the states for the first 36 months at 100% for both Medicaid and cash welfare, or TANF, T-A-N-F, temporary assistance to needy families. The federal government was supposed to reimburse the states for each one of these refugees brought for that 36-month initial period. The federal government stopped doing that in 1991. So it's been quite a few years since the federal government has paid the state of West Virginia or has paid any of the other states. In fact, there have been about, roughly, I think the number is 14 as of about a year ago. 14 states have withdrawn from the federal refugee program. And that's not without its own complications, which I'll explain. But the state of Tennessee, a year ago in March, I believe it was, their Attorney General approved a lawsuit to go forward, and the Thomas More Law Center is representing them to sue the federal government for the hundreds of millions of dollars that they're out. In essence, what the federal government did is it created an unfunded mandate that forces the states to have to pick up all of these costs, and they're not even following their own law by reimbursing the states for that initial 36-month period. So again, as you start to look at this thing and you see the fraud and abuse and the waste and the mismanagement of these dollars, and the organizations that are involved in this have their own lobbying group. It's called Refugee Council USA. And that Refugee Council USA is, you better believe, they're up on Capitol Hill and they're pounding on our Congress all the time to increase the numbers, because when the numbers increase, the money increases, and they get paid by the head, so there's more money involved. So, any questions so far? Do you want me to do this interactively or just keep talking?
You're doing great.
Okay. So the last, I mentioned about the first determination that President Trump's in. He said, and some of you might be familiar with this, that he would have a ceiling of 45,000 refugees. This was Obama's last one for fiscal year 2017, and he wanted 110,000. Hillary, if she'd been elected, we heard that she wanted 600,000 refugees brought in. So you could see the dramatic difference, and you can imagine, you know, with 110,000, the dollar amount would probably have gone up significantly, you know, above 1.5 billion, and with 600,000, you know, what would that be, 3 or 4 or 5 times that amount? So, but I really want to stress that, you know, Congress, the ultimate goal we're after here is to get them to repeal the Refugee Act of 1980. That's the only way to deal with these entities, these contractors that have been feeding at the government trough all of these years. Which, that brings me to this packet, this information packet that I passed out to you. If I can, I'm going to walk you through this. So if you have it handy there, this cover page that you'll see, the first 4 pages of that include a report. Now, some of that information is just slightly old in terms of the unemployment rate and so forth, but I presented this to the West Virginia House of Delegates Homeland Security Committee a year ago in February 22nd to be exact. And what I was trying to get across to them is that West Virginia has enough of its own financial needs and economic needs. What are we doing having refugees come in here who, based upon the average educational level of 10.2 years for a Middle Eastern refugee, they're not going to get really much more than a minimum wage job at $9 to $12 an hour. So you can imagine a family of 4 with that income level, they're going to continuously need to be subsidized. And so my report here, those 4 pages that you'll see on the front, it just goes into some of those details about the unemployment, about the unemployment rate. I mentioned in there about the June flood that we had in 2016 that we're all familiar with and so forth. So you can look at that, but it's just building a basis to say to our elected officials and to inform people across the state, you know, it's not justified. How can this be justified that these foreign nationals are being brought in when we have our own great needs here? The next piece there is from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and it's a list. You heard me mention the 9 contractors or the 9 agencies. This is a list of the 9. It's got a red tab at the top. It says VOLAGs on the side there. It's the first tab. Now, these are the 9 contractors that contract with our State Department to bring refugees in. Now, you'll notice that 6 of them have or are religious organizations. And an interesting point here is that when they contract with the federal government to bring in refugees, they have to sign a waiver that says they will not proselytize the refugees that are being brought in. So an interesting point that was made by a state senator in South Carolina, he said, wait a minute. Now, these are 501c3s. These are tax-exempt religious organizations that we give that status to, and they're signing a waiver that says they won't do what their intended purpose is about. So he makes a good point, and to me and to many other people, it calls into question, should they even have their 501c3 status if they're not going to do what the mission of their organization is?
I do want to say this. West Virginia Constitution says churches shall not incorporate.
Okay.
That's in the Constitution,
Yeah.
and that's been taken to the Attorney General, the Governor, Legislature, and the Supreme Court, and no one will enforce the Constitution.
Yeah.
They said, yeah, that's in there, but we can't do anything about it.
Because
And
they have no will to, right? I mean,
Well, these people take an oath to uphold the Constitution.
Yes, yes. Well, and you make a good point, Philip. We're seeing violations of the Constitution everywhere we turn. And I'm sure that's why your party formed, you know.
Exactly.
And some of the fights, the battles that you have and what you're trying to accomplish. But on this list of 9 voluntary agencies, it's kind of a joke because they're anything but voluntary from the standpoint of it's our tax dollars that's funding most of these, or all of these actually to one degree or another. The proponents of refugee resettlement here in West Virginia and elsewhere, they will tell you that, oh, well, there's no federal money involved in this. This is all, no state money, I beg your pardon. This is all federal money. And when I started hearing that, the first thing I said, well, let me make it clear to you, first of all, federal money is our money. Mm-hmm. And secondly, there are categories of state expenses that are involved, which we don't know those dollar amounts, but I have identified the categories. In fact, I have a poster board back here, if I could, in my corner here. Let me get these out. These are the categories, and I mentioned them a few minutes ago in starting out, that are state expenditures. You heard me talk about the Medicaid. Every state gets a certain reimbursement back from the federal government for Medicaid. I talked with the Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau for Medical Services here in West Virginia, and I wanted to know, what is West Virginia's reimbursement? The reimbursement for every state starts at 50%. So the state has to put up the money for Medicaid, and then the federal government comes in and reimburses the state at a minimum of 50%. West Virginia's reimbursement rate is 73.24%. So how they arrive at those numbers, I'm sure there's a big government formula that they go through, but I think it's based upon the economic conditions of the state and probably many other things. So keep in mind that the Medicaid costs for the refugees for the first 36 months are supposed to be paid at 100%. That's had stopped, as I mentioned, in 1991. The rest for the reimbursement amount that after those 3 years, we should be getting back, or actually we're paying a full 26%, just over 26%, that we never get reimbursed for. So the cost to West Virginians, to the taxpayers here, is a full 26 and a smidge more, 26% of the cost we never get reimbursed for. What that dollar amount is, I've tried through FOIAs to get it. I just submitted a FOIA back in November to the Bureau for Medical Services to find out the Medicaid cost and the CHIP cost, the Children's Health Insurance Program. And that's when I talked to the Deputy Commissioner. So I ended up writing her a FOIA on November 6th. Actually, I wrote her an email. And I said, if you need a FOIA, I'll be happy to do it. A month went by and I didn't hear anything. So on a month later, I wrote a FOIA request and I said, I am now making forthwith a demand within the 5 business days, which is allowed by law, that they have to respond to you, at least give you a response if they receive your request. Now, getting the information in 5 days, that's pretty unusual. So from there, the general counsel for the department, seems like all these departments now have their own attorneys in the government agencies. So the general counsel got in touch with me and wanted to make sure he was clear on what I was asking. So then another month goes by, and just was week before last, I believe, I got an email from him and said, the email said, under FOIA, we are not required to produce records that we're not required to keep. And then furthermore, when I was asking about the children's information, now I didn't ask any private or the PHI. the health information, the private information. I asked for, how many children there were, what counties they were in, what the cost of the children's health insurance program, just general questions. And I was told that under Medicaid law, they can't give me that either. So I'm not finished with this. It's just, it's typical of the FOIA process often. You'll get a document dump where they'll just dump pages and pages of stuff on you that you pay for. At least it depends on the department. Sometimes it's 25 cents a sheet. Sometimes it's $1 a sheet. But the West Virginia legislature did pass a law a few years ago where they cannot charge you for the time, the staff time that they spend to do it. So we'll see. I've got to pursue this further. But again, we're picking up Medicaid costs here that never get reimbursed. The state of West Virginia is picking up cash welfare. Again, it was supposed to be reimbursed by the federal government for 36 months. No reimbursement. State employees' salary. When I got into this, in fact, in the West Virginia Refugee Plan, it names who the state coordinator is. Her name is Jessica Dale. She was under Tomlin. She is now still under Justice, the state refugee coordinator. She is overseen by a supervisor at DHHR. So she's a full-time employee for the refugee program in West Virginia, which means she has a salary paid for by the taxpayers of West Virginia, and she has benefits paid for by us. I also FOIA'd DHHR, and I asked them for those salaries. And they said, well, you can go on the website and get them. The employees are listed. And I said, okay, well, where do I go? And so forth. And said, well, I'm not sure. That might be under construction. So again, you feel like you're getting the runaround, which I think in essence you are a lot of times. Or, maybe they just don't know and they're that uninformed. It could be either or both, actually. So I thought, okay, where do I get the salaries? I'll go to the auditor's office. So I audited. I went to the auditor's office, but first I had to get the names of who these employees are. Because the West Virginia Refugee Plan, we knew who this person was, but we also saw in there that there are 4 regional administrators over the 55 counties. So now, in all fairness, now those regional administrators aren't spending 100% of their time on refugees. They have other responsibilities. So when I considered that, I thought, well, let's take a fraction of their salaries, 10%, because we have to guesstimate it at this point, because these numbers have never been reported to our legislature. So we don't know, and our elected officials do not know what the cost is. And we have a refugee bill. We tried to get through the legislature last year, HB 2946, called the West Virginia Refugee Absorptive Capacity Act. And what it is, it's an accountability. It's a bill that would require DHHR to report to our elected officials in the legislature all of these various things, so that we know, the people know. They would have to report, they would have to inform the legislature and certain committees on a quarterly basis and so forth. So the Speaker, frankly, sent that bill to the Judiciary Committee, where I've come to understand, as I've learned a little bit about this process, that's where bills go to die. It is in the Judiciary. So it went nowhere last year. It's being reintroduced this year, this session. And Jim Butler, who is the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, he's been great. And he's really been a champion for us and for the people here in West Virginia for this. So we don't know, they always say don't get your hopes up, but that's one of the things. If you could contact your delegates and your state senator and tell them, we understand there's a refugee bill, that's going to be introduced, and we're in favor of that. We want you to support it, and you're activist. You wouldn't be in the Constitution Party, I think, if you were an activist, and so you're familiar with, lobbying your legislators, I would assume. So anyway, after I got the names of who the state employees were, the refugee coordinator, the regional administrators, and also their caseworkers. Now, at the time, I was told there were about 55 caseworkers over the 55 counties. And I said, you said 55? I said this to the DHHR supervisor. She said, well, yeah, I think so, something like that. So after I did another FOIA, it came back that there were about 30 caseworkers, actually. So we've got one refugee coordinator, we've got 4 regional administrators spending a piece of their time, and we've got roughly about 30 caseworkers spread across the state who are dealing with refugees. Now, I like to be as accurate as I can because your credibility stands on your accuracy. And I have to say that, in all fairness, even the caseworkers, not all of their time is spent on refugees. There are caseworkers who don't even have any refugees in their county. So when I get into the refugee report that's in your packet there, you'll see. So in all fairness, the best guesstimate that I could give this, just taking her salary, which I got from the auditor's office, along with these other people's salary that were identified by DHHR, the best guesstimate I could give you is somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 in salaries and benefits for the people in our state. Could be more than that, could be, a little less than that. But until there's a requirement by them to report to our legislature the true numbers, we won't know. Education. The cost of educating a child in West Virginia, and this number is from fiscal year 2013. And you'll see the cost, $11,132 per child per school year. Now, I did a FOIA to the Department of Education to find out the updated number. And the updated number, I think it was for the 2015-2016 fiscal year, was it was the same number. So this is a pretty good number to work off of. Having said that, it's my understanding that the federal government reimburses a little piece of that, about 10% back to the state. And so bottom line or net, you're looking at roughly $10,000 per child per school year in our public schools. So now you start to see, well, how many refugee children do we have here, in the state? Because now you can take a hard number and apply that and multiply it and say, okay, how much is it? Well, by all the FOIAs I've done and everything, they have not disclosed to me the demographics or those numbers that we can say, okay, X number of refugees came into West Virginia. How many of those were children? How many adults? How many working? Where were they from, and so forth. I don't know that number. Now, I do have another number, though, that I think you'll find of interest. Did you get one of these reports?
Yeah.
Okay. This is another report that I stumbled across as I was doing research. And this is also from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which that's the federal agency that oversees the refugees and brings them into the country. Did you have enough back there? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you'll notice that every state is listed here. And I have circled in red this first report or page of the report. It starts in fiscal year 2014. So that's when really we saw the surge from Central America and all those kids coming up on the tops of train cars and coming from Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala and Mexico and who knows where else they were coming from. So this report goes through fiscal year 2017, which ended last September 30th. But on the second page, if you look down there, you'll see West Virginia that I've circled and highlighted. And the number, when you add that across for those 4 years, it's 90 children. Now, the second report starts up because the fiscal year 2017 moves over, and fiscal year they had to make room on the report for fiscal year 2018, which just started last October 1. And if you'll look at the second page of that, you'll see that West Virginia has gotten more. So we got another 7 since October of last year. In fact, I was at the Capitol a couple days ago and talking to some delegates and state senators, and when I got home that night, I checked on this because I wanted to give you guys an updated report as much as possible of the numbers. And from one day to the next, when I looked at the numbers, 4 more children had been brought into this state. So these unaccompanied alien children, again, because we cannot yet, as of yet, get information, but if there's a bill, they would have to provide that, right? we have to make some assumptions. You know, that probably most, if not all of these children are K through 12. Well, if they're K through 12, that means they're probably in our public school system. So let's go back to education here. When we start to look at the numbers, you know, and what I did is for all these fiscal years, I added them up, the numbers, and I took the first year, okay, there were so many, I think 30. 30, and then the next year. So $300,000 would be the cost the first year at $10,000 a child, assuming they're all K through 12. Now the second year, in 2015, fiscal year 2015, we got 12 placed in the state. So if the 30 from the prior year are here, and foster care, group homes, residential facilities, wherever, now we've got 12 more, that makes 42. So we have a estimated or guesstimated $300,000 cost from the first year, a $420,000 cost the second year. Now you've got over $700,000 in just those 2 years. And these are not considered refugee children. These are unaccompanied alien children that are also placed here. So how many of the refugees we've received are children, I cannot tell you yet. So there's an unknown element there that, you know, has to be included in that number as well. Well, in essence, when I added these numbers across, and this was before fiscal year 2018 got added, it was over $2 million. Now, I'm hearing all the time, and I'm sure you are too, education cuts in the state of West Virginia, you know, budget cuts, budget problems, you know, budget struggles, you know. So I think it makes a strong argument. First of all, the people of West Virginia should have a say-so in it, as in every other state. I mean, this is really a states' rights issue. But, you know, aside from that, you have to say, well, you know, why should we be bringing in people, you know, that we have to provide all these services and benefits to for an extended period of time when we can't, you know, or have a hard time taking care of our own people, you know, our own children. So to me, it bolsters the argument, and that's part of what the effort is to prove to the elected officials, our legislators, that that's the case. Also interpreters. So not only are these kids in our school system, you know, which the refugee children and these alien children, but also we have to provide as state taxpayers, for the cost of interpreters for them. So again, this is an unknown cost.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Does anybody know if Jim Justice ever paid his taxes?
I don't have an answer to that. I don't know.
That would be quite hefty.
Yeah, yeah. I heard it was in the mid-4 million or some
They can pay for that himself.
big figure. Yeah. So you know, when you look at these numbers and with the alien children and the interpreters, what I thought, okay, where do I get this information? So I FOIA'd the Department of Education, and I asked them a number of questions. You know, how many children this and that and the other, and also I wanted to know the cost of the school lunch program and how much was being spent for that, and how many languages were being taught, you know, or had a need for interpreters in our public school system. And some of the numbers that I got back on the FOIA from the Department of Education, we have over 22 languages here in West Virginia that are requiring interpreters from kids in our public school system. Over 22. The ones that are less than 10, they don't even count those. So we don't even know from the report we got how many other smaller numbers there are that they're having to provide interpreters for too. So the largest group is Spanish. Over 1,300 kids are on the ELL or ESL program in West Virginia in our public schools. And then, I mean, there's so many languages. Some of them I didn't even know what they were. You know, there's Arabic and there's Russian and there's, you know, a bunch of Chinese, I think, was one of them. So there are many languages, which, you know, this brings up another point. Now, these aren't all refugee children, because in no way does this approach the numbers of refugees that we've received in West Virginia. Our numbers, thankfully, have been small, but, and that's what we want to keep it. We want to keep it that way, rather. But this is how it starts, and considering that West Virginia, i.e. Charleston in particular, was targeted by the Obama administration in which to expand this program, that's what we were fighting, or what we are fighting. even under the Trump administration in some ways. Consider Twin Falls, Idaho. Twin Falls, Idaho, a town of about 44,000 or so, 45,000, about the size of Charleston. And they were getting some refugees, and they've been getting them for years. And then they got a few more, and then they were getting hundreds a year under the Obama administration. I was told by someone who would be, I guess, considered my counterpart there in Twin Falls, Idaho, that it's just wreaked havoc in their community. They've got in their communities. They've got all these fragmented groups, this group here and that group. And she said we have over 5,000 of them here now. And she said the crime, the gang rape, the sex slave trade, the drugs. I mean, she went through a list of probably 10 or 15 different types of crimes that have just exploded through this refugee population. And you know, an interesting point about that is that in these foreign countries where a lot of these people come from, or basically all of them, where they're coming from, they're at war with each other in those countries. But when our government brings them here, they'll put them in the same communities, and they expect them to get along. I mean, this is another form of, I have to say, of government insanity. You know, that our communities are being invaded by the refugee program, and also our country is being colonized by these various groups that are being brought in. How are we doing? Is everybody picking up on everything? The second tab there, you'll see it says numbers. And this is a report I compiled from a website. It's the State Department's official website. It's called WRAPSNet, W-R-A-P-S-N-E-T. And that stands for Worldwide Refugee Admissions Processing System. They are the official government entity that tracks the arrival and placement of refugees in our country. There are 4 different types of reports you can get there. You know, refugee arrivals by destination, where they're going, by religion, and there are a couple of others. But let's just go through this report a little bit. This first page is really a kind of a summary page, and it's the total refugees, and I just updated this about a week ago. It's the total number of refugees that have been placed in West Virginia since the start of fiscal year 2003, which would be October 1 of 2002, excuse me. And it breaks down the nationalities. And you'll see that the largest nationality group we received are Iraqis. And the total now is 195. So again, I've had people say to me, well, why all the big fuss with such a small number over all these years? And I go, again, I refer to Twin Falls, Idaho, and other communities across our country. And when you think about the numbers of refugees that are coming in, especially like under Obama, his last year, he brought in 84,994 refugees. That's 2 cities the size of Charleston that are being brought into our country. You think Charleston is 45,000? That's just about 2 cities the size of Charleston that are being brought into our country and spread across this nation, that we are paying Medicaid, interpreters, you know, school costs, all the things that we went through before. That second chart at the bottom shows the towns where they've been placed. And you'll notice that Moorfield has gotten the lion's share of that. And, you know, the first question that when I figured this out, I thought, well, what's in Moorfield? So I did a little research and found that there's a poultry plant in Moorfield. Chicken plant. JBS, which I think it's JBS, which is owned by a Brazilian company. So this brings up another point that you need to know and understand. Big meat, big labor, and big industry are really behind the push to bring these refugees in here for the cheap labor. What happened, if you remember under George Bush, under his administration, they were doing some raids on some of the meat packing plants across the country. I remember seeing that in the news, and they would go into a meat packing plant and they would, you know, take 200 people out that were illegals, you know, from the factory. And so the big meat, big industry, and all of these entities figured out, wait a minute, we can use the refugee population because they're here legally. And we don't have the problem with shutting down our factories because we have legal workers. But they could pay the refugees the same low wages, and depress the wages of Americans by hiring the refugees. So they responded to what was a problem in their industry. But again, that's why they are behind pushing the refugee industry. There's a man that owns Chobani Yogurt. He's a Turkish immigrant, and he worked with the Clinton Global Initiative to bring in more and more refugees. In Twin Falls, Idaho, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, exists the largest yogurt factory in the world, and he wants refugee labor for his yogurt plant there. So again, you start to see these connections. You connect the dots and why the refugees and why they're coming.
Yeah, there's a term for that. It's called a public-private partnership.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, you're right, Philip. Exactly. Yeah, which we, the taxpayers, end up, taking it in the head for what they do. This next report, in fact, is where I produced this report from. So this is from the RAPSNet website itself that I mentioned. So you can go across there and see each year, and it just confirms the report that I produced, which I think kind of is a little easier to follow maybe than what this one is. So I won't belabor that. The next two reports in your packet there, you'll see Trump and Obama. You see those? We're still in the same section, we're at the numbers section. Now, what I wanted to do is to make a comparison of, we hear about the slowdown of refugees under Trump, and I wanted to take a look at that and show you how significant that is. It's not a solution, it's just a slowdown. But I did this report from October 1 of 2017, which was the start of the fiscal year for the federal government, the fiscal year 2018. And ran it through January the 10th. Now, we were going to meet, I think, on the 13th before, but the weather had us rescheduled. So I did this report for that time frame so you could see. So under Trump, for the first, 3.5 months, he brought in 5,495 refugees into the United States. That second page behind there gives you the breakdown by state. And you'll notice West Virginia, and even on the map there, West Virginia received, during that 3.5 month period, received 0 refugees. Now, just as of about a week, maybe 10 days ago, we got the first refugee. I've been told we're supposed to get 14 refugees this year. That's what Catholic Charities told me. Whether that'll happen under Trump, I don't know, because in fact, I informed Catholic Charities refugee director. I said, did you see the report from Reuters dated December, or back to December, where the State Department met with all 9 of those contractors that I referred to initially and told them that if they were bringing in less than 100 refugees into their resettlement site, that they weren't going to fund them or support them, and they wanted them to scale back. Well, Catholic Charities of West Virginia this year is scheduled to bring in 14. They brought in 1 so far. Last year they brought in 13. The year before that they brought in 25, I believe it was, and the year before that 31. So never has the Catholic Charities resettlement site here approached the number 100. So I said to the refugee director, I said, does this mean they're going to close your resettlement site? And she, it's up in the air. She doesn't know. After 37 years, it would be hard to think that they would, because they'll fight for that. But, if the State Department goes along with what they've told these contractors, this resettlement site may collapse on itself here in the upcoming months. So that remains to be seen. But the second report there, you'll see I have Obama in the upper right-hand corner. And for that same time period that I showed you for Trump, Obama brought in 26,477 versus Trump's 5,495. You see those numbers? So that shows you literally what kind of impact Trump's slowdown and his extended extreme vetting has done. Any questions about that?
That's good.
Okay. Let's move to section 3. Now you'll start to get a flavor for the cost of this, which I mentioned the numbers early on. But now this report from Refugee Resettlement Watch breaks it down by contractors. And you'll notice there at the bottom, again, they're listed, the 9 that we've talked about. And if you go back, you start to fan through those pages and go back, I think it's 5 or 6 pages, or 2 or 3 from the back. They're not numbered the way the report is produced. But you want to get to this one where it says United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. That's about, I think, the 3rd page from the back. I'll give you, yeah, that's the right one. Now, you'll notice it says 97% funded by taxpayers. That's our money. And United States Conference of Catholic Bishops is the main contractor that subcontracts with Catholic Charities of West Virginia to bring the refugees in here. So when you look at this, the revenue they received, that first category is federal grants and agreements, over $79 million. And this is for fiscal year 2014. But they're getting that about every year. Now, will they get that same amount under Trump? I guess it remains to be seen because of the slowdown. They're not going to have as many refugees coming through. But this is what they were getting for years. And there's another category on this report that says travel loans. I think that's about the 3rd one down there. And let me tell you what a travel loan is. The refugees, in fact, that come to the United States are primarily chosen for us by the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So we're not even picking most of our refugees initially. They get to the camps, they sign up with the UNHCR, and then after that point, at some point rather, our State Department gets involved. They're looking at the President's determination, and how many are going to be allocated, and the funding that Congress has made, and all the things that go into it. So they start the process of the refugees that have been approved. Then the State Department gets involved, Homeland Security, the FBI supposedly, and all these different governmental agencies. This is a good place for me to make a comment about that. And it's really in this vetting section, but I want to say it now. The proponents of refugee resettlement said, all along, oh, the vetting's wonderful. You can trust it. It's secure. It's 18 to 24 months. Nobody goes through the process of vetting like these refugees do. Well, that's baloney. I have reports in there which will back up that under the Obama administration, he committed to the United Nations that he would bring in 85,000 refugees for fiscal year 2016. And of those 85,000, 10,000 of them would be Syrian refugees, period. So at the start of that fiscal year, October 1, fast forward to about April 1 or April 7, somewhere in that time frame of the following year, that's about 6 months into that fiscal year of 2016. At that point, he had only brought in about just a little over 1,300 Syrian refugees. And about, the number, I have other reports here, I just don't want to dig through them. I do have them here handy, so I can tell you. By that point in time, for 6 months into that fiscal year, he had brought in from Syria 1,366 refugees in 6 months. Now, he told the United Nations and committed our country to bringing in 10,000. And he's got only 6 months to do that in. So in order to meet that deadline and that goal of bringing in 10,000, he cut the vetting time to 3 months. So these proponents that will tell you, that, it's wonderful and you can trust it, he did cut the vetting time, and there are several articles in your packet that will give you documentation for that. So this was a major problem. Now, how's he going to get in another, 8,700 in 6 months when he only got in 1,300 in the first 6 months? Had to cut the vetting time, and that's what he did. So here were the problems. The vetting time was cut to 3 months. They bypassed a lot. I mean, really, if something took you 18 to 24 months to secure before, how can you do it in 3 months now? You can't. It's impossible. Another problem with the vetting is that at the time, under the Obama administration, let's see, it was former FBI Director James Comey. We all heard a lot about him in recent couple of years. He said, along with James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, along with General John Allen, which was Obama's special envoy to the Middle East, along with Mike McCall, who was head of Homeland Security in the Congress, in the House, and then even Hillary herself at a private meeting in 2013, they all said these refugees could not possibly be vetted. So they were telling us and confirming to us and saying, oh, it's wonderful, they're vetted. Meanwhile, they're saying, these high officials in our government were saying, no, we can't vet them. They come from failed states, Yemen and Libya and, the Sudan and all these places where the Middle East was on fire. So they were, literally lying to us. So why do I bring up this vetting issue now when Trump's in office and we hear extreme vetting and, that's supposed to be going on? I bring it up specifically because under the Obama administration, during that 6-month period in which he cut the vetting time to 3 months, there were over 10,000 that he brought in here under that 3-month period of time. Just 10,000 Syrians. So, in fact, the exact number was 12,587. That was the number. So Obama exceeded even his own goal of 10,000 Syrians to bringing in that number, 12,587. So there were only 1,300 before the first 6 months. Now there's over 12,587 was the number. So again, it's simple math. You can figure out there were thousands that were brought in under that shortened vetting time. So those people are somewhere in our country, living here, with a permanent residency at least. And that's the process. When they come in, the day they arrive, depending on the hour of the day, they are taken to the Social Security office or the next day, and they get a Social Security number. The next day, or if there's time that day, the volunteers that were working with the refugee coordinator, not the coordinator, but the refugee resettlement site, they take them to the welfare office and sign them up for their benefits, or Medicaid, or TANF, and they have to qualify just like any resident or citizen of West Virginia would. So that gets them into the system. Within 1 year, they have to apply for a green card or permanent residency, and within 5 years, they can apply for citizenship. Now, we were told that under the Obama administration that the Justice Department was giving out grants to a lot of these refugee communities where the numbers were large to assist them and help them along the way to get to their citizenship. So again, we have lots of these people in this country we really know very little about. All of those high government officials said they couldn't possibly be vetted. The vetting time was cut, and there was another, in the vetting section here, there's an article that Senator Sessions, I mentioned before, he was the only one that had held a hearing to look over the refugee program since 9/11. He did it for a 2-year period. And I don't think any have been held in the Congress, or excuse me, not in Congress, in the House of Representatives. So they brought in a man by the name of Leon Rodriguez, who was head of the United States Customs and Immigration Services, USCIS. And they grilled him about the vetting process and how are these people, what's the process, how do they get in? And now, both Senator Sessions and Senator Cruz, who were grilling him, they had obtained a leaked memo from someone. How these memos are always leaking in our government. They obtained a memo that said that there are refugees getting in solely on their testimony alone. So they asked him that, and they asked him again, and it was almost like he resented being asking. And finally, I think it was after 3 or 4 times of pinning him down, he said, yes, some do get in based on their testimony alone. So this adds, this is even worse. We've got shortened vetting times. We've got, government officials saying they can't be vetted. And we've got people who are getting in here on their testimony alone.